Welcome to stream recap number 6. We start off this rendition with the remnants of the French loyalists tightly held in our grasp in Strasbourg. Cries from Congress and the international community about the previously branded Ottoman blob have only grown in number, and we find ourselves under pressure to act soon. The AEF, under the veteran command of Pierce Ramsay, our most experienced general, find themselves with their next task prepared, despite their current task still being undertaken. The man deserves a uniquely named cavalry unit. Do we have any suggestions? Please bear in mind that his army, and particularly his cavalry unit, are veterans of the Madrid/Spanish theatre. They have fought in North Africa, they've fought in Italy, and pretty much all over the central Mediterranean. They were then shipped up and have fought in Brussels, as well as Strasbourg/Alsace-Lorraine, which is where they now find themselves. This whole time without any major casualties or major losses, other than the betrayal in Madrid. The fifth and we hope final siege of Yankton is on the horizon. This would complete the mainland conquest of the present-day United States of America. In order to keep pressure on Yankton, we did have to reassign border armies from the Great Lakes/Great Rivers border, which we have with Canada or Great Britain, which has left us weakened in the case of hostilities. We can only hope that that is not what happens. A plan was proposed by the rudimental and early members of our proposed intelligence service to destroy the crown in the British Isles, throwing the empire into rebellion and opening up a load of chaos, which will only work to our favour. So at the start of this stream, we found ourselves thrust into the melting pot of war that is Europe against our will. With many potential enemies moving around, the next strike truly could come from anywhere. The build-up to the fifth venture into native Yankton did not get off to a good start, as the retreating remnants of our previous attempt were caught off guard during their fall back to friendly territory, and found themselves in a last-stand situation where it was decided that they would kill as many of the enemy as they could. Despite a positive start, they were doomed from the get-go. Buckle guns, our secret weapon, would unleash devastating volleys, and for a while our troops wondered if they could pull this off. Was this possible? The general, an unknown man who took command, was heard crying, "This is our Thermopylae, boys." No one knew why he had a slight Scottish accent. Some wondered if he was an immigrant or a mercenary. The truth is lost, as was the battle. A dumbfounding and surprising situation rose from the aftermath of this battle. The Plain Nations, as they were referring to themselves, offered us a peace treaty and a substantial payment that was literally laughed out of Congress. Upon further discussions, it was discovered that the natives did in fact possess some unknown technology called interchangeable parts, leading us to question all of our previous misconceptions about these peoples. Bows and arrows with interchangeable parts? How can we put this to better use in our hands? The American military, recovering from the embarrassment and shame they had faced in and around the Plains territory, found themselves on the other side of the world in the form of the AEF, the pride of the American military. A joint navy/army venture sieging the last remnants of the French loyalist cause in Strasbourg. Dutch spies had informed us of a massive force that had been hastily raised in eastern France, heading in an attempt to save the king and his court in Alsace-Lorraine. It was decided that we had to act, and the siege fortifications became bustling with activity as our exhausted and under-equipped force of elite soldiers were asked to follow General Ramsay one more time. After a bombardment of mere hours, the AEF, who for a change found themselves fighting an army of equal size, albeit from a defensive point, decided that they would sally towards the breach in the enemy's fortifications and set up a defensive point until we had manoeuvred to more favourable positions around the fort's perimeter. This led to some great results, as determined attempts to sally out of the breach continued, despite the need for the loyalist forces to simply buy time for their reinforcements to arrive. A regiment of Slack's Rangers, supported by the 4th Obanan Marines, were sent to take one of the outlying bastions of the fort and create a second front on the defensive emplacements. However, this proved to be a mistake, as the bridge over to the fort was sabotaged, leading to the lion's share of these regiments being trapped on a slowly crumbling mound of explosives, awaiting their fate. Only a few of these veterans would survive this endeavour, and General Ramsay decided to withdraw them to the reserves. As the bodies piled up high in the breach and casualties started mounting up on both sides, the decision was made to sally in, with General Pierce screaming the famous lines of "Once more unto the breach." The battle-worn Marines entered and were surprised to find very little resistance left, other than one decimated regiment of dragoons. Before the infantry could get in position to fire a volley, the last shots of the theatre echoed out in the form of explosive shots from our mortars with multiple direct hits. In the aftermath of the battle, there was no sign at all of the royals nor the king. At least, for now, the French monarchist threat was gone. In the aftermath of the Battle of Strasbourg, Congress in its infinite wisdom decided that giving Strasbourg to the Dutch in exchange for one of the Caribbean holdings was the correct move. Our diplomats were successful in this endeavour, with the offering of some military access which allowed a Dutch peacekeeping force to remain during the handover process in Punta Curacao. In the aftermath of our diplomatic success with the Dutch, it was decided that a few months of rest and repairs were in order to allow new weapons to be transported from the States to Brussels to reinforce the AEF, whose next objective had been made clear: the Ottoman Blob. The army was upgraded and older equipment was given to other regiments to be decommissioned or used for training purposes. Once they had been replenished, they boarded our fresh new ships, including the new prototype rocket vessel, and headed for the Gibraltar Strait. To our surprise, we found an Ottoman blockade. Not for the first time, may we add, and it was decided that this would be the last instance of this happening. War was declared there and then. During the formal declaration of war, it became clear that a simple war with the Ottomans alone was not possible. They had allies in the form of the British, who we had been in a long border tension with to the north of the US mainland. The question was, would they be joining their far-flung ally? Would the Mamluks and the Persians be joining? The answer to all of the above was yes. With the shock of the British holding the Ottomans' hand, we sent our previously mentioned outdated equipment and force toward the British mainland. The unthinkable was about to happen: an American military engagement on British soil. The intelligence services suggested Edinburgh would be open to the taking, with some sympathy lying in the north with the Scots. Culloden and the atrocities that followed still fresh in the minds of some, the siege was set. Upon sailing toward the Greek peninsula, the famous Ottoman Blob was spotted on the horizon. It had indeed grown in number, and an army of this size had not been spotted in the area since the fall of Constantinople. General Pierce decided that a quick disembark and attack on Athens would be made, shock and awe tactics, similar to the Athenians at the Battle of Marathon. The following siege was undertaken quickly, and there were a few errors made. Firstly, not preparing the army for the incoming reinforcements in the area, focusing primarily on the enemy's main army. Secondly, not using the naval units at our disposal to scout the enemy's outlying armies and see what we were going to be up against. During the siege of Athens, the AEF found itself exactly where it always had previously. Their famous saying of always outnumbered, never outgunned ringing true. The defensive lines were set with a number of regiments in reserve. As the opening salvos echoed, some of our outlying scouts realised the enemy had reinforcements coming from our western side. A defence was scrambled, but was it too late? As the lines were reformed to face the new incoming threat, the enemy's front line engaged our centre, cavalry charging into our cannon battery as our infantry did what they could to disrupt the charge. Our centre held solid and routed the initial cavalry charge. We awaited the rest of their army engaging. Once the enemy reinforcements had been routed, focus was turned back towards the main engagement. The Ottomans were a different sort of enemy, somewhat reminiscent of the natives we had encountered in the States, only they had more guns and a professional yet somewhat outdated military. Luckily, our puckle guns once again showed their worth, routing multiple units from their initial engagement, giving our lines time to reload and reform. Before we knew it, the Marines combined with Slack's Rangers did what they did best. They won another battle against death-defying odds. Athens was ours, giving us a foothold in Greece. Whilst the success of Athens was a major stepping stone in Greece, it did present new issues. The Ottomans had a holding behind our lines now. That would be our next target. We quickly set to work repairing Athens and upgrading what infrastructure we could to allow easier logistical supply, something we believe would improve to be integral to our success here. The Canadian frontier was next, thousands of miles of border with a handful of choke points which we were sure pitched battles would be fought at over and over again. Congress had spoken and it was overwhelmingly decided that we would be the ones on the front foot. Simultaneous attacks were launched. The first of these engagements was fought on the plains across from Quebec on the banks of the St. Lawrence River. The army we faced was a strange hybrid of elite regiments of foot and dragoons with lots of experience in fighting in the north of Canada, as well as local militias thrown together, adding bodies to the British lines. The professionalism and experience of our commanding officers proved to be pivotal in the winning of the first engagement with the British on the banks of the St. Lawrence. A new doctrine was tested under the watchful eye of Charles Hunnam, which consisted of using local hunters of the Great Lakes as ranged infantry. Their knowledge of the area allowed them to move around almost invisible to the naked eye. This, along with the use of our new dragoon regiments, added a level of skirmish we had not previously been able to achieve. Tightly packed units of line infantry do not stand for long when light, fast-moving dragoons are appearing on their flank constantly, peppering them with lead. The first in what we expected to be a long string of battles had been fought along the Great Lakes. The second engagement, happening almost simultaneously as the previous, was on the banks of Lac Saint-Pierre. This army was more standardised and consisted largely of raw recruits fighting an experienced enemy force, which consisted of some line infantry, grenadiers, and dragoons, as well as some tribal natives that we may have forced from our land, taking an opportunity to be paid to right a wrong. We took a strong defensive position and dug ourselves in. Sadly, the enemy chose not to engage us immediately from our position of strength, so the decision was taken to put our cavalry to the test in a flanking manoeuvre. The British forces had taken position behind a large hill, rendering our artillery largely useless. Their cannons atop of the hill, returning fire. Our cavalry moved to the flank, and dragoon on dragoon action ensued. The success of our dragoons, which were supported from 2 regiments of horse, was overwhelming. The enemy's cavalry was routed almost to a man, and we had the mobility advantage. With this being the case, the enemy infantry realised they had to press towards us or risk further war crimes, carcass shot. The previous failures of dragoons had been against native enemies who lacked any real doctrine of organisation. Dragoons, when given the opportunity, were shown to be incredibly effective. Once the enemy infantry came into the Valley of Death, as it was dubbed, the battle was all but over. Line infantry volleys thundered over the frosty plains while dragoon hoofs were heard on all sides of the British. Our trapper units that had been hired in an irregular role really did shine and pinned multiple units down as they tried to flank, buying our main line time to reorganise. A second victory within the same week had been achieved against the British in Canada. The counter-offensive was on. The First Battle of Tunisia was the next engagement. We found ourselves with our new rocket artillery and a hastily assembled force. The enemy's army was made up largely of local conscripts with a few professional units from Mother Russia. We took a defensive position at the bottom of a valley, hoping to use a large building as a garrison for sharpshooters, which we aimed to use to protect our flank, while our artillery batteries rained death from above. No one knew what to expect from the rockets, and when the first volley was fired, some of our own men were about ready to flee. We believe the noise of the rockets spooked the enemy, with some of the enemy's cavalry charging us head on, not even making it close enough to hurl an insult. The rockets then thundered overhead once again, sprinkling the enemy line with shrapnel, causing the native conscripts to question the poor choices that had led them to be marching towards such a weapon. Just for your understanding, here is some in-game audio from a rocket barrage. Look at this. Do you reckon it does more morale damage than anything? Just as our lines of muskets started to unleash a wall of lead, the rockets would come crashing down again, working in conjunction as a swirling vacuum of death. The enemy actually had 2 armies attacking us here, reinforcing from behind their initial army. By the time the second army got to the battlefield, they were greeted by their comrades retreating past them. Needless to say, it did not take long to scatter the rest of the Ruskies. Tunisia was now firmly in American hands. This ensured that the Russian threat was removed from the Mediterranean. Hostilities then picked up in Scotland, as recently appointed Leon Kelly found himself in command of the Siege of Edinburgh, a pivotal battle in our plot to overthrow the British Empire and send the colonies into disarray. We, for a change, outnumbered the enemy and severely outclassed them in both arms and artillery. They did unfortunately have a modern star fort, which wouldn't be the easiest to crack. In our deployment, it was decided that General Kelly would mirror General Ramsay's deployment and tactics at the Siege of Strasbourg. We would concentrate on one corner of the fort, knocking a hole and turning the choke point against the enemy. Whilst the Battle of the Gap was being fought, our puckle guns would fire a relentless barrage at the crack, while our mortars rained fire in from above. In the aftermath of our victory, we found ourselves deciding where to strike next, Ireland or London. The decision was made to head post-haste for London and to press the advantage we had while the British were on the back foot. Then came another surprise in the form of a diplomatic declaration, this time in the form of Austria declaring war. Our former co-belligerent in the wars against the Spanish and French, it did not come as a shock as years of inbreeding had led to the infamous Habsburg Chin. If we were not previously overstretched with our wars against the Ottomans, British and Russians, we were now. For once our treasure was scraping the barrel and the necessary recruitment both in terms of ground forces and construction of ships fell behind. War taxes had to be raised. Our expert diplomats were dispatched in an attempt to seize some of our more far-flung wars. The Ottomans had been worn down and peace was something they were willing to accept, despite us now holding much of modern Greece, a great base of operations in the Mediterranean should they be needed. Our navy sailed from Greece to Corsica to thwart a British attempt to land in the Med. It was no secret that the Royal Navy had no rival in the entirety of the world. On a good day we would be able to field a singular heavy first rate. The Royal Navy had full lines of them ready to be deployed. We were aware that both fleets were worn going into this battle, and we were outclassed in numbers as well as size of ships, but the American Navy had a point to prove. We decided to take a little more unorthodox approach by having our navy split into multiple lines with our heavy bomb ketch ships supporting. This, with the wind at our backs, meant confidence was high. As the two navies drew ever closer, the silhouettes became towering wooden hulks. Our admiral in the lead ship acted first and took a lot of the initial blows, hoping to draw some of the leading ships out of formation in order to create opportunities for our heavy first rates, which were closely following behind. As the two lines of ships started to attempt to cross the T, all resemblance of the initial battle plan was out the window. The enemy had placed half of their heavy ships at the front and half towards the rear. A bold move. Would it pay off? Right, here's what we're doing. We're going to get a broadside right ready. We're going to get the shot that takes out sail. We're going to go along the second rate. No one would be wrong for taking a look at the current situation. What with surrendered ships and ship positioning being taken into account, and drawing the conclusion that our navy had this in the bag. Sadly, things soon turned for the worst. A number of our heady leading ships were set alight, and I believe we had one powder magazine detonate. We had then used our advantage of the wind at our backs and found ourselves having to manoeuvre round again to get more shots off, our large leading ships struggling to get themselves around quickly. Then the smaller Royal Navy vessels, much more manoeuvrable, started getting themselves into positions where they were firing through our ships from front and rear, and before we knew it, we had 3 ships left, which were all slowly sinking. The first Mediterranean naval force had been lost to a ship, to a man, a blow to the US Navy. In the aftermath of the battle, we found our unrivalled power in the Mediterranean being diminished quickly as we lost our freedom to transport units when the situation dictated. Then came the dreaded 5th Battle of Yankton, the 3rd Siege of Yankton. Some of our soldiers and even our congressmen had claimed that the Plains nations had cursed this area and all who enter it. Our lessons had been learned and defence in depth was the principle we would deploy. These raw recruits, who had never faced combat, had a fairly stern task in front of them. To succeed where 5 other armies had failed. The Plains people by this point had acquired a number of our lost arms, including a cannon emplacement, and now used them against us. This time around, however, we had the 24-pounders with us. We went for a front line of line infantry with canister shot mixed throughout. We had a second line consisting of grenadiers and reserve line infantry to plug any gaps that may appear. On the 5th occasion, our raw recruits rose to the challenge. Our cavalry worked the flanks superbly, buying time when it was needed, yet not overcommitting, our skirmishers protecting them while they withdrew and reformed. Our centre did find itself in melee at one point. That was when the reserves were sent in and the gap was plugged. The reinforcing natives then attacked from the east, so a reform was on the cards while our regiments there held the line. As the last few warriors of the Plains nation charged at us, we almost felt sorry for them. Almost. With the final few volleys roaring through the woodland, we found ourselves on wait to see if more of them would appear from nowhere, like on all of the other occasions. Except this time, none came. After a 3-year struggle and 5 attempts, the somewhat ironically named Yankton was welcomed into the United States of America, completing our conquest of the mainland. Destiny had been manifested, but the definition of destiny can be interpreted as each man wishes. can be interpreted as man wishes. We're going to continue this and just run this unit down just because what they represent. The news of the victory at Yankton became widespread. It was kept quiet, however, that the siege of London had begun, which is where we will resume next time. As Stream 6 comes to a close, we find ourselves finally crossing the rivers and the Great Lakes into British Canada. We have a holding in Montreal. We are sieging Quebec. We have a full army moving towards Rupert's Land. We have two defensive armies in Niagara and Fort Pontchartrain, Detroit. There we go. And over here, I'm happy to report that we finally hold Yankton after multiple attempts. I believe it's a total of 5 battles, 3 sieges of Yankton and 2 battles of Yankton. We finally hold it. We are in sort of turbulent waters with Britain here, and by that I mean actual turbulent waters in terms of their navy. Their navy is, I don't even know how much bigger than ours. It completely outclasses us, as most of their navy is just first-rate ships of the line or super goddamn heavy-rate ships of the line. As we go down to the Caribbean, we did try to get a hold on naval control here, but honestly they've broke through us and they just seem to be outproducing us. So down here there's very little change. It's very much status quo from the stream start. The only difference is we managed to trade Alsace and Lorraine for Punda, so that's been a bit of a success. Other than that, we've had we've managed to keep a hold of all of our holdings here, and we've also taken Acadia. As we go to Europe, I honestly don't know where to summarise here. We still have Flanders. We were hoping to use it as in a trade deal with Netherlands to get their South American their final colony, but that's went tits up. Over here, we managed to land one of our armies in Edinburgh in Scotland. We have liberated it. We are now sieging London, although the army is currently replenishing. It's not quite at full strength, and honestly, I'm expecting them to sally out and give us a hell of a scrap. The long-term plan here is that we take London and we take Ireland, and we basically end the British Empire, and we can see we can see what we do with the remnants of it. As we move down into the Med, this is another situation I struggle to summarise. We now have Tunisia. We've taken that from Russia. This is becoming our heartland here in terms of the Med. The Maratha Confederacy decided that, you know what, we've had enough of those oppressive Americans. They came here and they took Sardinia from us. The American Expeditionary Force had a very successful expedition into Greece. We took Patras and Athens, and then we managed to peace the Ottomans. We have repelled the Ottoman blob and saved the world. The American Expeditionary Force have been sent to Naples. They're going to be fighting the Austrians soon. I'm hoping that we can honestly fight them to a stalemate and then just look at what we're dealing with, because everything is just wrong. Austria declared war on us quite literally, and I'm not exaggerating, bringing the entirety of the known world. And we are just basically getting, we're kind of getting gangbanged from all sides, and we're struggling to produce a navy. Well, for the first time in a long time, we're having to actually tax our people. So yeah, thank you for tuning in live on the stream and also watching this recap. I thought we were in the dying embers of this, and then here we are with Austria doing what the Habsburgs do best, and that's sticking their bits into places they don't belong. So I'll see you guys on the next one.